The Trump administration has promised to move the headquarters of some agencies away from the Washington, D.C. area. There's even legislation proposing the so-called strategic withdrawal of agencies for meaningful placement. Yes, the Swamp Act. Our next guest says he's skeptical this would help much or save money. You might not like his alternative, but it's an idea that also has support. From the Cato Institute, former Economic Committee staff member Chris Edwards spoke with Federal Drive host Tom Temin about the ideas.
And you have written that the idea itself of moving agencies away to bring it closer to the people, is the way the administration has been proposing this, is not such a good idea. And you've got a couple of reasons. What are they?
Well, the idea of moving workers out of Washington, I think that the genesis was that Senator Joni Ernst noticed that a lot of federal office buildings were empty. And then the Trump administration folks and Elon Musk said, hey, let's move all the workers back to their office. But then there's some Congress persons and Senator Ernst who said, hey, no, even better, let's move them out of Washington. I'm all for downsizing government, but I don't think this plan will save taxpayers money.
And that's not really downsizing, just taking 500 people or 1,000 people at headquarters and moving them to Wichita or something. It's actually a net cost, and you have the same 1,000 people.
That's right. I think moving workers from the D.C. region out to places like Iowa and other places across the country, there'd be a big logistics cost in moving all these folks. Then you could sell federal buildings, but you'd have to build or lease new federal buildings where the workers are going to be moving to. And then there'd be all the ongoing costs of if all these federal agency decision makers were in places spread across the country, well, they still have to come back to D.C. and meet with congressional staffers and fly in for congressional hearings and meet with White House people. So there'd be all these additional costs of fly-ins and hotel costs for all these thousands of workers spread across the country to meet and discuss with other leaders in Washington. So I'm not sure it would save money in the long run.
And that idea of being close to Congress, because if you are in the policy and budgeting positions, that's really where you need to do. That's what headquarters does, with operations often out away from Washington, closer to where they need to be, or sometimes in almost every county if it's agriculture department.
Yeah, that's right. So there's already a problem in the federal government that decision-making is very slow because there's excess layering in the federal government. I think this would make federal decision-making even slower if these agencies were spread even further apart and further from the real decision makers in Washington, which are members of Congress and their staffers and people in the White House. There's also the issue of within D.C. there's a lot of knowledge sharing. I mean, there's federal experts on federal IT systems that can move between agencies now. There's federal executives and managers move between agencies and can bring best practices across these agencies. So I think you would lose some of that if agencies were siloed across the country. So, one of the Congress persons who favors some of this decentralization is Representative Ashley Hinson of Iowa, who suggested we move USDA out to Iowa. But I mean, that was, in my view, it would silo the agency. It'd be separate from other decision makers. And I think it would strengthen the special interest power of, the agricultural interest if the headquarters, say, of the USDA was moved to Iowa, which wouldn't ultimately be good for federal taxpayers.
And from the standpoint of service to farmers for the various programs USDA has, they have all of these field offices, thousands of them, I believe, that are peopled with people that have communications and computer systems tying back to headquarters anyway. And
well, that's right, Tom. But I think this raises, one of my other objections here is I think the focus ought to be here on downsizing. We do have a massive deficit problem where the government's running annual deficits of almost $2 trillion. I think we ought to focus on downsizing some of these programs like farm subsidies, where most of these subsidies are going to wealthy farmers. The federal government spends $30 billion a year, and it has, as you pointed out, the USDA has hundreds of field offices across the countries to hand out these subsidies to farmers. So rather than moving more of the bureaucracy outside of Washington, I think we ought to downsize the programs that, reduce these federal subsidies to farmers, for example, to begin with, and not just, decentralize the subsidies.
We're speaking with economist Chris Edwards. He studies fiscal affairs for the Cato Institute. And let's get to the downsizing. I mean, President Trump promised to do that, and now we've seen this massive effort through trying to get people to resign early, to close down USAID and so forth. And if one believes in a smaller government that does fewer things, do you think this administration is going about it in the right way?
Well, one metric to start off with here is that the federal government this year will spend $7 trillion. Only $400 billion of that will be the cost of the federal worker pay and benefits for the 2 million or so federal civilian workers. So, while I'm absolutely in favor of thinning the bureaucracy, the Congress actually needs to defund the programs first. So I raise the issue of farm subsidies. To take a serious stab at finding efficiencies in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, let's eliminate some of these excessive subsidy programs for farmers. Or I also, for example, favor the effort to downsize federal K-12 spending. But, the trick there is not to thin the bureaucracy. You've got to eliminate the programs first and allow the states to take over K-12 education funding. So I think, Congress needs to lead these downsizing efforts. There's only so much the executive branch can do by itself.
Right, and those functions that people decide the government should do, you want them to do it right, and that takes a certain number of staff positions in general.
Well, that's right. Ultimately, these programs, almost all of them are in statute. So you can fire the workers or induce them to resign, as the Trump administration wants to do. But ultimately, the members of Congress who favor those programs, you want that spending. So while there may be some short-term savings in the sort of scattershot approach he's taking here, but in the long run, if you want to downsize the government, Congress has to act. Else, the next president's just going to come in to office and replace all those workers if the programs aren't repealed by statute.
Right, and let's get to the topic of telework. And you've expressed the opinion that maybe it's not such a great idea to force everyone back to the office 5 days a week.
Well, Senator Joni Ernst has made a big thing to her credit about the fact that a lot of federal office buildings are partly or mainly empty since COVID, because a lot of federal workers have a remote work ability these days. She wants, and the Trump administration wants, all these workers back into the office 5 days a week. I don't think that's the way to save money. I think the way to save money is allow federal workers to work remote if it's reasonable for their jobs, and then sell all these extra office building or convert them, for example, with local zoning laws to residential. There's a housing shortage in this country. Federal buildings take up a lot of space. Let's convert a lot of this extra federal office space into residential.